I don't have clothes. Can I sleep with you? Those words, whispered and trembling, hit the rancher Elijah Ward harder than a physical blow. He froze. In the door frame stood a woman. Not just a woman, a giantess, her frame wrapped in nothing but shadows, shame, and a constellation of fresh bruises. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of his small, lonely cabin. It was a sound he knew well. He knew the sound of wolves, the crack of an outlaw's pistol, the dead silence of a prairie winter. But he'd never heard a sound like this. A woman, stripped of everything, her teeth chattering from more than just the cold, asking for the one thing he had sworn he'd never give again. Shelter. His hand gripped the wooden table so hard his knuckles turned white. This cabin was a fortress he'd built against the world after burying his wife. He'd sworn no one would ever get close enough to hurt him again. And yet, here she was. A ghost walking out of the night. Her massive shoulders were hunched, like a wounded animal trying to make itself small. In the flickering firelight, he could see tears glistening in her eyes, tears she was fighting with every ounce of her will not to let fall. The only sound was the crackle and spit of the fire in the stove. A heartbeat. 2. Then Elijah moved. Slow. Deliberate. He reached for the heavy wool coat he kept by the door, the one that had seen him through a dozen blizzards. His throat was tight, but his voice came out low and steady. Here. He draped it over her shoulders, careful not to let his fingers brush her skin. She flinched anyway. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but it told him everything he needed to know. She was expecting another blow, always expecting another blow. The coat was laughably small on her. The sleeves stopped halfway down her forearms, the hem barely reaching her mid-thigh. Her sheer size seemed to shrink the room, but it was the way she clutched the fabric to her chest, like it was the last shred of dignity on earth, that made something ache deep inside Elijah's chest. Sit, he said, nodding toward the single chair by the fire. By the fire. Her bare feet left dark, damp prints on the floorboards as she moved with an awkward, painful grace. The chair groaned in protest as she lowered her weight into it. The firelight was unforgiving. It revealed more than Elijah wanted to see. Rope burns, red and raw, circled her wrists. Ugly purple bruises bloomed on her arms, her shoulders. A fresh cut sliced along her collarbone, too clean to be an accident. Someone had done this to her, deliberately. He filled a tin cup with warm water from the kettle, not coffee, and set it on the small table beside her. Her hands shook so violently as she reached for it that she spilled half before the rim even touched her lips. She drank like a woman who had been wandering the desert. Elijah leaned against the far wall, his arms folded across his chest, watching her. His mind was a storm of questions. A woman like her didn't just appear on the prairie, naked and beaten. Someone had brought her here. Someone had wanted her broken. And the kind of men who would do this, they weren't the kind to just let her go. They'd come looking. Her eyes, shadowed and haunted, flicked up to meet his through a curtain of tangled, damp hair. You want me gone? Her voice cracked on the last word, as if she had asked that question 100 times before and already knew the answer. Elijah shook his head. Just once. Sharp. No, he said. You'll stay here tonight. Her shoulders slumped. Relief washed over her face, but it wasn't joy. It was pure, bone-deep exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that happens when the body finally gives up fighting, even if the heart isn't ready. She pulled the coat tighter, curling into herself, trying to disappear inside the worn wool. The silence between them stretched, heavy and fragile. Elijah fed more wood to the fire, not because it needed it, but because his hands needed something to do. This cabin was built for one, for solitude. And yet, for the first time in a long time, It felt a little less empty. He finally broke the quiet. "What's your name?" She hesitated. Her lips pressed into a thin, white line, as if the word itself was dangerous, a secret that could get her killed. Then, so soft it was almost lost in the crackle of the flames, she whispered it. "Mara." Elijah let the name hang in the air. Mara. It was a name that carried weight, old, strong. He nodded slowly. "Elijah." Her gaze lingered on him, uncertain. She was measuring him, weighing the name, deciding if the man attached to it could be trusted. She said nothing more, just held the coat close, and for the first time since she had stumbled through his door, her breathing began to even out, to slow down. Elijah didn't unroll his bedroll. He didn't even sit down. He took the rifle from its pegs on the wall, pulled the chair from the table over to the door, and sat. He kept watch. The night stretched on, long and dark. The shadows danced and shifted on the walls, playing tricks on his tired eyes. Behind him, Mara slept in fits and starts, jerking awake at the slightest sound, a floorboard creaking, the wind shifting direction, before sinking back into uneasy dreams. Each time she stirred, Elijah's grip tightened on the cold steel of the rifle. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of what might be coming through that door for her. When the first slivers of gray dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, Elijah was still awake. His eyes were bloodshot, but his resolve was like iron. Mara sat up slowly, her thick dark hair a wild mess around her face. She looked at him, really looked at him this time. And for a fleeting moment, a silent understanding passed between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was enough to keep her from running. Elijah stood, his joints protesting, and poured water into the basin just outside the door. "You want to wash?" he asked. His voice was rough from the long night, but it held no judgment. Just a simple, matter-of-fact kindness. "Ain't no one around to see." Mara nodded once, clutching the coat tight as she stepped out into the crisp, cool morning air. Elijah gave her privacy, but he stayed close, listening. The splash of water, her sharp intake of breath as the cold hit her skin, the soft scrape of cloth as she tried to wash away more than just dirt and blood. When she came back inside, her eyes were clearer, but her jaw was still set like stone, holding back 1,000 unspoken words. Elijah slid a plate with a hunk of cornbread across the table. "Eat." She took it with both hands, eating slowly at first, then with a desperate hunger, as if she was afraid it would be snatched away. Elijah watched her, not with pity, but with something heavier, something that felt like responsibility. He didn't ask her what happened. He didn't ask who did this to her. Not yet. He just let her eat. He let her exist in the small circle of safety he had drawn around them. When the last crumb was gone, she set the plate down gently. Her voice was low, but for the first time, it was steady. "I stay today." Elijah met her eyes, and for the first time, he didn't freeze. He didn't hesitate. "You stay." The fire popped. The wind pressed against the windows, and for the first time in 5 long years, Elijah Ward felt the weight of another heartbeat inside his home. It should have felt like a weakness. Instead, it felt like an anchor. But an anchor can't help you when a storm is coming. And looking at the bruises on Mara's skin, Elijah knew a storm was already on the horizon. Elijah didn't ride out to check the north pasture that morning. He couldn't leave. Not with Mara sitting by the fire, her body as stiff as a board, her eyes darting to the door every single time the wind rattled the latch. So he busied himself with chores close to the cabin, stacking firewood, chopping kindling, mending a leather strap, any task that kept him within sight, within earshot. The ranch would have to wait. His priority had shifted. Mara tried to stand when he picked up the heavy splitting axe, but the moment her bare feet touched the rough-hewn floorboards, she winced, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her lips. The soles of her feet were a mess of cuts and raw blisters, souvenirs from a long, desperate journey across stone and thorn. She tried to hide it, pulling the coat tighter around herself as if the wool could somehow erase the pain. But Elijah saw. He saw everything. "Sit," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "I work," she muttered, her voice a low, gravelly sound. It was as if her entire sense of worth was tied to her ability to be useful. "You'll tear your feet open worse," he said, not unkindly. "Let them rest." She rose anyway, defiant. She towered over him, a mountain of a woman, and for a split second he felt small. But it wasn't her size that unsettled him. It was the way she carried her strength like it was a terrible burden. Her broad shoulders were curved inward, as if she was constantly apologizing for the space she occupied in the world. He stepped closer, his boots solid on the floor. It wasn't a challenge. It was a quiet statement. "If you want to work," he said, "start small." He went to his small chest of supplies and came back with a strip of cloth and a needle with thread. He placed them in her hands. "Stitch that blanket," he told her. "I'll chop." Her fingers, large and calloused but trembling, closed around the tiny needle. She sat back down. She obeyed. Not because he had commanded her, but because he had given her something to do that wasn't born of shame. And so the rhythm of the day began. The sharp crack of his axe splitting logs, the soft tug of her needle pulling thread. Two lonely people, finding a strange comfort in simple work. Every so often, Elijah would pause, his eyes scanning the long ridge that overlooked his property. He was watching for riders. His jaw was tight. The image of Mara's bruises burned into his mind. The men who did that to a woman were men without fear, men without consequences. And men like that always come back. By noon, the air was thick with heat. Elijah set down the axe, wiping a sleeve across his sweaty brow. He looked inside and saw Mara bent over her stitching, her brow furrowed in concentration. The blanket in her lap was now a patchwork of uneven, clumsy lines, but it was being mended. Her face held no pride in her work, only a desperate hunger to prove she belonged. "Good work," he said, his voice simple and direct. She looked up, startled, as if the kind words had struck her harder than a fist. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She just dropped her gaze back to the thread, her shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly. They ate their midday meal in silence. Cornbread and beans. She sat on the floor by the hearth. He sat at the table. It was a distance they both seemed to need. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. They laughed. Elijah put down his tin plate. "They laughed when they pulled my dress," she said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. It was a terrifying emptiness. "Said I was too big for a husband. Said no man would want a wife bigger than his own bed." Her hand, holding the spoon, began to shake. "Then they took my food, my shoes. They left me with nothing." The weight of her words settled in the small cabin, pressing down on him. Elijah's hand clenched into a fist on the table. He'd seen cruelty in his life. He'd seen outlaws torture men for sport. He'd seen soldiers burn homesteads to the ground for no reason at all. But there was something uniquely vile about men who laughed while stripping a woman of her dignity. It made his stomach churn with a cold, hard rage. "You're safe here," he said at last, his voice steady and certain as a rock. She shook her head, not looking at him. "Safe? No. They come. Men like that. They always come back." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes boring into her. His voice dropped to a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Then let them," he said. "They'll find me waiting." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Mara's eyes slowly lifted to meet his, and for the first time he saw something in them besides fear. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a tiny flicker of belief. A fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this man meant what he said. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and blood red, Elijah took her outside. He handed her a broom he'd made from bound twigs. "Sweep the porch," he told her. "Keep your feet on the wood until they heal." She nodded, her dark hair falling across her face as she began the simple, rhythmic task. Each scrape of the broom across the planks seemed to wear away a little more of the heavy silence between them. Elijah worked nearby, repairing a loose rail on the corral, but his eyes kept shifting, scanning the shadows that grew longer in the fading light. By nightfall, a single lantern burned low inside the cabin. Mara was curled on the floor near the fire again, the coat still wrapped tightly around her. Elijah laid his bedroll by the door, his rifle within easy reach. Sleep was a fickle visitor that night, chased away by every gust of wind, every skittering sound in the dark. And when Elijah did finally close his eyes, he dreamed of laughter. Not Mara's, cruel, ugly laughter echoing in the darkness. He woke before dawn, his heart pounding in his chest, instantly wide awake. He was certain he'd heard the crunch of boots on the dirt outside. In one fluid motion, he was on his feet, rifle in hand, peering through a crack in the shutters. The yard was empty. The only movement was the cottonwood trees swaying in the pre-dawn breeze. Still, he didn't lower the gun. He stood there listening, every muscle tensed. The silence of the prairie pressed in, heavy and absolute. But nothing came. When he finally turned from the window, he saw Mara watching him from her place by the fire. She wasn't startled to see him standing there with a rifle. She wasn't even afraid. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. It was as if she was trying to figure something out, trying to decide if his vigilance was for his own protection or for hers. "Elijah," she said softly. It was the first time she'd spoken his name. He met her gaze, his own eyes steady. "You do not freeze," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an observation. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't." And in that moment, a silent oath passed between them, an unspoken promise. Whatever came down that trail, laughter, cruelty, or fire, he would not freeze again. But he had a sinking feeling that promise was about to be tested. And soon. The wind turned sharp that night, carrying a smell on it that didn't belong. Smoke. But not the familiar, comforting smell of his own cabin fire. This was different. Acrid. Wrong. Elijah smelled it first while sitting on the porch, his rifle balanced across his knees as the last light bled from the sky. The horses in the corral sensed it too. They shifted uneasily, their ears pricked, their heads turned toward the distant ridgeline. Elijah knew that kind of stillness. It was the hush that falls right before trouble shows its face. Inside, Mara was sewing by the firelight, the old coat still draped over her shoulders like a shield. The moment Elijah's posture changed, her head snapped up. She had the instincts of a hunted animal. She didn't ask what he smelled. She didn't have to. She already knew. Her eyes flicked to the rifle in his lap, then to the dark doorway. Elijah stood without a word, his boots making no sound on the porch planks as he scanned the tree line, his eyes piercing the deepening gloom. For a long while, there was nothing but the sound of the wind whispering through the tall grass. And then he saw it. Movement. Two figures, staying low to the ground, slinking along the fence line like coyotes. He backed into the cabin, closing the door slowly, silently. He didn't want them to know they'd been spotted. "Two of them," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Mara rose to her feet, her huge frame casting long, dancing shadows across the room in the firelight. Her jaw was tight, her knuckles white, but her hands didn't shake. "Clay," she whispered. The name was like a curse on her lips. "Maybe," Elijah said, his voice flat, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. He slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, then nodded to her. If they come for the horses, I'll step out. You stay here, rifles by the table, if they push through this door. He didn't need to finish. Mara nodded, her face grim. She crouched low by the hearth, out of sight from the window. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, not on the door. Her faith was in the man, not the wood. An hour stretched out, each minute feeling like a lifetime. The tension in the small cabin was so thick you could taste it. Then a sound from outside, the scuff of a boot against dirt. It was followed by a low laugh that cut through the silence. It was an ugly, cruel sound, a familiar sound. Mara's hands curled into tight fists at her sides. When a shadow detached itself from the darkness near the corral gate, Elijah moved. He slid the bar back with a quiet thud, swung the door open fast, and stepped out into the moonlight, the rifle already leveled at his shoulder. "Leave the gate," he commanded, his voice ringing out in the still night air. The figures froze. One of them was indeed Clay, his hat pulled low, a familiar, arrogant smirk painted across his face. "Evening, Merrick," he drawled, his tone far too casual. "Didn't mean no harm. Just passing through." "You're a long way from the saloon," Elijah said, his voice like iron. "Turn around and keep walking." Clay's grin widened, but his eyes weren't laughing. They flicked past Elijah, trying to peer into the dark cabin behind him. "Heard you got company," he said, his voice laced with a greasy insinuation. "Thought we'd see for ourselves." "You've seen enough," Elijah said, taking a half step forward. "Go." The second man, younger and clearly nervous, shifted on his feet. "Come on, Clay," he muttered. "Ain't worth it." Clay spat in the dirt, his eyes narrowing into angry slits. He looked from Elijah's rifle back to the cabin. "You can't keep her forever, old man." "Watch me," Elijah said. The tension crackled between them, electric, ready to explode into violence. For a long, stretched heartbeat, it felt like someone was about to draw. Then, with a muttered curse, Clay backed off, his boots crunching on the gravel as he turned back toward the trees. The other boy followed close behind, casting one last nervous glance over his shoulder before the darkness swallowed them both. Elijah didn't move. He stood there, rifle ready, until the night had swallowed every last sound but the lonely cry of the wind. Only then did he lower the rifle and step back inside, barring the door behind him. Mara was still crouched by the fire, the spare rifle clutched in her hands. Her breathing was fast and shallow, but her eyes were steady. "They are gone?" she asked. "For now," Elijah said. He leaned the rifle against the wall. Mara rose, her shadow stretching tall and imposing. "They come back." "Maybe," Elijah admitted, his voice grim. "But they know I'll be waiting." Her jaw trembled, but she didn't argue. She only reached for the coat, his coat, that first night's offering of safety, and pulled it tight around herself again. But something had changed. For the first time since she had stumbled onto his land, the fear in her face had shifted. It was still there, a ghost haunting her eyes, but now it was standing shoulder to shoulder with something new, something that looked a lot like trust. Neither of them slept much that night. Elijah sat in his chair by the door, rifle across his lap, a silent guardian. Mara lay on the cot he'd set up for her, her eyes wide open, fixed on the dying embers of the fire. But when she finally did drift off to sleep, she didn't wrap herself in the blanket quite so tightly as before. At dawn, Elijah was outside, checking the corral. The boot tracks were still there, scarring the dirt, proof that they had been closer than he liked. He scuffed them out with the heel of his boot before Mara came outside. She didn't need to see the trail of the predators that were circling her life. When she did step out into the cool gray light, her chin was held a little higher than the day before. "You are not afraid?" she asked, her voice carrying a strange new strength. Of them? Elijah took a long drink of coffee from his tin cup. I've been afraid of worse, he said, his eyes on the horizon. Fear is just a thing that keeps you awake. You don't ever let it run you. Mara studied him for a long moment, her large fingers tracing the rim of her own cup. Then, for the very first time, her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. That night, the cabin felt different. It wasn't just his home anymore. It wasn't just her shelter. It felt like something in between, something shared. By the third evening, the ranch no longer felt like a place that was waiting for trouble. It felt like a line drawn in the dirt, daring trouble to step across. But they both knew trouble was coming. And it wouldn't be just two men next time. It would be a reckoning. Elijah was stacking the last of the firewood when he heard it. The sound of horses. Not one horse, not two. 3. The rhythm of their gallop was sharp, purposeful, cutting through the calm evening air. It wasn't the sound of men passing through. It was the sound of men coming for a fight. "Mara," he said, his voice low and urgent. She was already on the porch, the rifle he'd left by the door clutched in her hands. She didn't need to be told. Her jaw was set like granite as she watched the rising cloud of dust on the trail. Elijah took the rifle from her, his movements economical and swift. He checked the chamber, then placed it back in her hands. "Stay inside." "I stay by the door," she said, her voice impossibly steady. He didn't argue. There was no time. He stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the soft dirt, and positioned himself near the corral, making himself the clear and obvious target. The riders slowed as they came into view, their horses snorting and stamping. Clay was at the front, just as he'd expected. But this time, he was flanked by two other men, older, harder-looking men. They pulled up just out of easy gun range, a clear and calculated provocation. "You're trespassing, Jensen!" Elijah shouted, his voice carrying in the still air. Clay grinned, a humorless slash of teeth. He swung one leg over his saddle and dropped to the ground. "Easy, Merrick. We just came for a little talk." "Talk from the road," Elijah shot back. But Clay ignored him, taking a few swaggering steps closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. His grin was as sharp and ugly as broken glass. "You got no right," he snarled. "Keeping her up here, like she's yours." Elijah's jaw tightened. "She's not yours either." One of the other riders spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "She don't belong here, Merrick, and you know it." "She stays where she wants to stay," Elijah said flatly. Clay's grin faltered, replaced by a sneer. "Does she? Or is she just too scared to run?" He raised his voice, shouting toward the cabin. "Tell him, Mara. Tell him where you belong." A floorboard creaked on the porch, and then Mara stepped out of the shadows of the doorway. She was a towering figure, silhouetted against the lantern light from inside. She held the rifle not like a victim, but like a soldier. Her voice, when it came, cut through the air, stronger and clearer than Elijah had ever heard it. "I stay here," she declared. "I do not run, not again." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken threats. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Clay's smirk finally cracked. He looked genuinely surprised. "Girl," he stammered, "you don't know what you're saying." "I know," she said, her voice ringing with newfound conviction. "I know you take my clothes. I know you laugh. I will not beg you again." The two other riders shifted uneasily in their saddles, exchanging a glance. This wasn't going how they'd planned, but Clay's face hardened, his embarrassment twisting into pure rage. He took another step forward, and that was enough. Elijah raised his rifle, the movement smooth and deadly. He sighted down the long barrel, right at the center of Clay's chest. "Mount up," he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The world seemed to shrink down to the tiny space between the end of Elijah's rifle and Clay's arrogant heart. Then one of the other riders tugged on his reins. Clay, he ain't bluffing. It ain't worth it. Clay's eyes burned with hatred, but he spat in the dirt one last time, turned, and swung himself back into the saddle. He wheeled his horse around, his face a mask of fury. "This ain't over, Merrick. It is if you keep riding," Elijah shot back. They rode off, slow at first, a swaggering retreat, then faster as the trail began to swallow them in dust and darkness. Elijah didn't lower the rifle until the last hoofbeat had faded into the distance. Only then did he allow himself to take a breath. He turned back toward the cabin. Mara was still standing in the doorway, the heavy rifle still clutched in her massive hands. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly, but her eyes were steady, burning with a fire he'd never seen before. "They will not stop," she whispered. "No," Elijah admitted, stepping onto the porch closer to her. "But they know now. They know you've chosen a place. They know you're not alone." Mara leaned the rifle against the wall. Then she stepped down from the porch, right into his space. Her hands, calloused and rough from work, came up and pressed flat against his chest. Her touch was hesitant, but firm. "You stand for me," she said, her voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Elijah met her gaze. "Every time," he said. Her fingers curled, gripping the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer. He didn't freeze this time. He didn't hesitate. He bent his head, and he kissed her. It was careful at first, a question. Then, as she leaned into him, her formidable strength folding into his quiet steadiness, it became an answer. And for the first time since she arrived, a broken thing in the night, the fear in her shoulders finally seemed to break and fall away. That night, the cabin was no longer a shelter. It was theirs. Mara didn't wait by the hearth. She took his hand and led him to the cot, pulling him down with her. And when she laid her head beneath his chin, she let out a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a release, like a burden finally being set down. Elijah held her, one hand resting on the strong curve of her back. And for the first time since he had buried his wife, he allowed himself to picture a tomorrow that was worth waking up for. At dawn, as he saddled his horse, she came out onto the porch. Her hair was neatly braided, her shoulders were squared. She looked different, settled. "I'm going into town," Elijah said. "Best we end this for good before it can start again." He paused, looking at her. "You coming?" Mara hesitated for only a single breath. Then she nodded. "I come?" They rode together, side by side. They weren't hiding this time. And when they rode down the main street of the small town, and every head turned to stare, to whisper, Elijah didn't look away. And Mara didn't lower her chin. For the first time in her life, she wasn't begging for a place in the world. She was claiming one. The sheriff's office smelled of stale tobacco, dust, and desperation. It was the kind of room where 1,000 arguments had been settled, but very few problems had actually been solved. Elijah pushed the door open and held it for Mara. She had to duck her head to step inside, and her presence immediately made the small room feel cramped, the walls closer. Every eye on the street had followed them, and the whispers were like dry leaves skittering in the wind. But Mara kept her chin high, her eyes fixed forward. Sheriff Thompson, a man with a graying beard and weary eyes that had seen too many saloon brawls, looked up from his cluttered desk. "Merrick," he said, his voice tired. Then his gaze shifted to Mara, and he paused. "Heard some talk." "You heard right," Elijah said, his voice flat and hard. "Clay Jensen and 2 of his friends came to my place last night, trespassed, threatened her." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. He folded his hands over his ample belly. "Clay's been a handful since he was a boy." His eyes, surprisingly, softened a little when he looked at Mara. "Ma'am," he asked gently, "you wanting to press charges?" Mara's jaw tightened. She stood tall, a pillar of resolve, though Elijah could see her hands were curled into fists at her sides. "I want them to stay away," she said. Her voice shook at first, then steadied, gaining strength with each word, as if she were forging them from iron. "No man takes my clothes, my food, my name from me. Never again." Sheriff Thompson studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Reckon we can make that happen," he said. "I'll write it down. Put a report on file. Make it official." Elijah stepped closer to the desk, his voice sharpening with impatience. "Talking isn't enough, Sheriff. Writing it down isn't enough. If they set foot on my land again, I won't be coming to you with words next time." The sheriff's tired eyes met his. There was no argument in them. "I hear you, Merrick. I'll ride out to the Jensen place myself. I'll speak to his old man. I'll make sure Clay understands exactly what's at stake." By the time they stepped back out into the bright sunlight, some of the weight in Mara's shoulders seemed to have lifted. The stares from the townspeople still followed them, but this time she didn't flinch. She looked right back at them, holding their gaze until they were the ones to look away first. As they mounted their horses, Elijah watched her. Her back was straight. Her eyes were hard with something new, not fear, resolve. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the silence of two strangers trying to navigate an awkward truce. It was the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed to explain themselves to each other. Back at the cabin, Elijah unloaded the sacks of flour and the box of nails they'd bought at the general store. Mara went straight to the hearth and with steady, practiced hands began to build up the fire. Soon, the familiar, comforting smell of beans and salt pork filled the room. She moved with a sense of purpose now, like she belonged there, not as a guest, not as a beggar, but as someone who had made a choice. Later that evening, as the fire burned low, casting a warm glow over the small room, she sat brushing her long, dark hair with a comb Elijah had bought for her weeks ago. When she was done, she braided it neatly, her fingers moving with a sureness he hadn't seen before. She turned to him, the firelight catching in her eyes. "You give me coat," she said, her voice soft. "You fix my dress. You fight for me. Why?" Elijah set down the leather strap he'd been mending and met her gaze. "Because I want you here, Mara," he said, his voice full of a sincerity that surprised even himself. "Not because you need a place to stay, but because you choose to stay." Her breath hitched in her throat, but she gave him a slow, sure nod. "I choose," she said. She crossed the room in 2 long strides, knelt on the floor in front of him, and took his rough, calloused hand in both of hers. "I stay." Elijah's throat tightened. He covered her hands with his own, the feeling of her skin against his a grounding force. "Then we make this home," he said, "for good." The next morning, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, washed clean by a night of gentle rain. Elijah went out to check the fence line, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw Mara on the porch. She was wearing the simple dress he'd bought for her, her hair was braided, and in her hands she held a small cloth bundle. She stepped down into the dark, damp earth of the small garden plot he had long neglected. She knelt, untied the bundle, revealing a handful of seeds. With a tenderness that seemed at odds with her great size, she began to press them, one by one, into the soil. Elijah walked over and knelt beside her, the rich smell of the earth rising up to meet them. They worked side by side in a comfortable, easy silence. The sun climbed higher, warm on their backs, painting the land in shades of gold. For the first time since she had arrived, there was no fear, no urgency, only the quiet, hopeful rhythm of building something that was meant to last. Elijah looked at her, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, a rare, genuine smile breaking across her face as she worked. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she wasn't just passing through his life. She was a part of this land now, a part of this cabin, a part of him. And this time, he wasn't letting go. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read every single one.